Today is Monday, 2nd September, and though the bulk of this program, as of so many other programs that I've been doing over the last 2+ years, will be taken up with the events in the conflict in Ukraine, I'm going to start with the recent elections in Germany, in Thuringia and Saxony, two regions of Germany, I should say, which I do not know. Personally, I've never visited them, though I am quite familiar with parts of Germany further west and, of course, with Berlin itself. So, just a few quick observations about these election results, which have sparked shockwaves across Germany and indeed across Europe and in the West. And I'm going to say that, in my opinion, nearly all of the commentary about these election shocks is wrong in its most fundamental and simple ways. Now, the first thing to say is that if we look at the results in Thuringia, this is a region of beautiful towns and cities which used to form very much, in some respects, one of the great intellectual powerhouses of Germany. It's apparently a region of great natural beauty. As I said, I've never been there myself. But if we look at the results in Thuringia, well, here the AfD, the right-wing party that attracts so much attention and so much criticism, both in Germany and abroad, came first with around a third of the vote. The CDU, the main opposition party in Germany, which defines itself as being on the centre-right, came a distant second with 23% of the vote. In my opinion, the single most striking result in Thuringia, apart from the breakthrough by the AfD, is the very, very strong vote for Sarah Wagenknecht's left-wing party, breakaway in some respects from the old Die Linke party, a party that ultimately emerged out of the old East German Communist Party, though it did establish connections with various political groups in Western Germany as well. Die Linke was, for a long time, the standard bearer, not just in East Germany, but across Germany, of what might be described as the traditional left. But for some time now, it's clear that it's lost its way, and where at one point it won, as I remember, in a Bundestag election, around 12 to 13% of the vote across Germany as a whole, it has been gradually dwindling away. Well, out of the husk of the old Die Linke, a new phoenix, if you like, has emerged in the form of Sarah Wagenknecht's party, which, despite some rather laboured attempts to pretend otherwise, is very, very much a party of the old classical socialist or social democratic left. Now, I want to say that because I've been reading articles, both in the British media, including one specifically by the British journalist John Kampfner in The Guardian, but also several articles in the German media as well, which are trying to represent Sarah Wagenknecht and her movement as being somehow on the far right. Now, I don't want to devote too much time to debunking this absurd claim, but suffice to say that it is absurd. There are fundamental differences in historical interpretation and political character between Sarah Wagenknecht's movement and that of the AfD. In addition, the AfD overall has what one might expect of a right-wing party, a strong bias towards market solutions and those sort of things, whereas, as one would also expect of a self-proclaimed socialist or social democratic party, the Sarah Wagenknecht movement inclines more to state intervention. The fact is, as I said, it is a classical left-wing party. There is a certain sharing of positions between the Sarah Wagenknecht party and the AfD on certain topics, like, for example, relations with Russia. Both want improved relations with Russia, an end to support for the Ukraine war, a reconciliation with the Russians in some form. And both also have opinions about immigration, which are in conflict with those of what one might call the centre, the predominant neoliberal centre that represents Germany's establishment. However, you examine them carefully, the positions of the AfD and Sarah Wagenknecht's movement on immigration are by no means identical. Again, I'm not going to discuss them in detail here, but briefly, the AfD clearly doesn't like immigration at all, whereas Sarah Wagenknecht's movement tends to have a more conventional view that immigration needs to be something that is brought under control, but it is not opposed to immigration per se. On the issue of relations with Russia, the fact that there is an overlap between the opinions of the AfD and of Sarah Wagenknecht's party does not mean that these parties are identical or that they are both part of some notional construct called the far right. Not so long ago, there was a political consensus in Germany, one which spanned both the right, the centre, and the left, that good relations with Russia was something that Germany should seek and which ought to be a foreign policy priority. So just saying, parties that disagree with each other on fundamental things can often find points of agreement between them, and that's all that one should see in the fact that both Sarah Wagenknecht and the AfD agree on the one issue of relations with Russia. Anyway, the point is, coming back to the election in Thuringia, the AfD, which is an anti-establishment party, what the Russians like to call a non-system party. It is not part of the political establishment, of the established mainstream political system. The AfD, which is a non-system party of the right, has won a third of the vote, and two parties on the left, Sarah Wagenknecht, which got around 16% of the vote in Thuringia, and the left party, which in Thuringia still exists and which still has residual support, and which must also be considered, like Sarah Wagenknecht's party, at least for the moment, a non-system party. Well, the left got 13% of the vote. So what this means is that in Thuringia, the right, the anti-system right, the AfD, got 33% of the vote, and the anti-system left got just under 30% of the vote. Roughly 60% of German voters in Thuringia voted for non-system parties. They might not agree with each other, these parties. As I said, the AfD has different views on economics and indeed on immigration than Sarah Wagenknecht's and the Left Party. But the fact is that they're all of them non-system parties, and the voters in Thuringia supported them. Now, there were also elections in the neighbouring state of Saxony, and here the results were not that dissimilar. Now, the CDU, which is one of the mainstream parties, a system party, in fact, in some respects, when we speak of the Federal Republic of Germany, we are perhaps justified in describing the CDU as the system party of the Federal Republic of Germany. It has been the dominant party in German politics ever since the establishment of the Federal Republic of Germany in the 1940s, early 1950s. Anyway, there in Saxony, the CDU just managed to hold on to emerge as the biggest party with 31% of the vote. The AfD came second with 30% of the vote. The Sarah Wagenknecht movement here got 11% of the vote, and by my understanding, the Left Party managed around 4.5% of the vote. So, again, if you put together the votes that the non-system parties got in Saxony, the non-system party on the right, the AfD, which got 30% of the vote, and the non-system parties on the left, Sarah Wagenknecht's party and the Left Party, who between them got around 16% of the vote, where you find that the non-system parties in the regional elections in Saxony got a roughly 46% of the vote, less than the 60% that they achieved in Thuringia, but nonetheless a strong comment on the political situation, the political mood in Saxony. I'm going to suggest that the reason why the system parties, the mainstream, if you like, the neoliberal centrist mainstream in Saxony did better than in Thuringia is because, of course, Saxony is where two of the main cities, the big cities in eastern Germany, Leipzig and Dresden, are located. And these are cities with a more international and European flavour than the more German kind of politics that you will find in Thuringia and in the smaller places in Saxony. And, well, for the moment at least, the AfD and the left-wing parties have not yet been able to break through in Leipzig and Dresden to the same degree. That's my guess. I say this is purely a guess because I haven't actually had a chance to look at the votes, the breakdown of the votes in these two cities, Leipzig and Dresden. And if I'm wrong about this, I will welcome any corrections. But the point is that, again, in Saxony, the anti-system parties, the non-system parties, got around 46% of the vote. Now, there's been a huge amount of literature, discussion, commentary about the vast differences that still exist between West Germany and East Germany, that East Germany and West Germany are supposedly drifting apart from each other, that that we might even eventually see the breakup of Germany and all of these things. This is, in my opinion, a complete misunderstanding of the dynamics of these elections. The reality is, as we have discussed many times on the Duran, and as I have also touched on in programs on this channel, the mood, the economic situation in Germany, both in the East and in the West, is bad. The economy is sagging and has been doing so ever since the 2022 cut-off from Russian gas and all the various problems that arose from that. But it also needs to be said that despite all the appearances of German economic prowess, those who have been tracking conditions in Germany closely for a while, as I have been doing, have been saying for some time, for a decade at least, that behind all the strong figures and optimism, boasting about German economic prowess, productivity was basically stagnant. There was a failure to develop new technologies and new industries. That Germany was living on its economic legacy and was in effect stagnating. And the point I have made many times, and it's a point that Alex Christoforou and I have discussed on many occasions on the Duran, is that the ultimate cause of this is the extent of the political immobilism in Germany. This was already starting to appear in the 90s and early 2000s, but it gained full institutional force during the long premiership of Angela Merkel, who developed or established in Germany a type of politics of a sort that is called in Italy transformismo, whereby government essentially limits itself to managerial and administrative duties, does not have dynamic or energetic policy objectives, but governs from the centre, tilting a little to the left or a little to the right, depending on the eddies and currents of German opinion. And the result of this political immobilism has been a devastated landscape within the political mainstream, with no strong political leaders emerging to take Merkel's place when she eventually left the scene, and also no real plans or ideas about how to address Germany's deep and increasingly deep-seated problems, which have been getting worse and worse as the years have passed. And, well, there have been other factors which, of course, have reinforced the immobilism, the extent of Germany's sense of, or at least the German leadership's sense of political dependence on the United States, their willingness to follow in the track of American foreign policy, especially with regard to Russia, but also China as well, rather than pursue German national interests. Their intimate interconnection with the European Union and the European Union project, which means that power has gradually shifted from Berlin to the EU centre in Brussels. But ultimately, it's this construct of immobilism which has been buttressed by the way in which Germany has been able, until recently, to reap rewards from Germany's position at the centre of the EU system, which explains the malaise. And of course, what has happened over the last 2.5 years is that with the loss of cheap energy flows from Russia, with the deterioration in the geopolitical climate, with the weakening of trade links with Asia and specifically with China, all of the problems, all of the accumulating problems which were gathering and building up even as Merkel acted as the Queen of Europe. They've all come out into the open, and this weakened and reduced neoliberal mainstream establishment centre in Germany has no answers for these problems. Now, why then is the revolt, if you like, against this the centre happening in Eastern Germany faster than it is in Western Germany? There's a very simple reason, and this does go back to the way in which German reunification was conducted in the 1990s. Because what essentially happened in the 1990s was that West Germany took over East Germany, and the West German political system, with all the established parties that were parties of the West German political landscape, the West German form of the CDU, the West German form of the FPD, the SPD, which of course had no official presence in East Germany at all. Anyway, they were all then grafted, if you like, onto the East German landscape. So it's unsurprising that East Germans, as they begin to become increasingly disaffected with a malaise, which it must be stressed again, is a general German malaise, are more willing to turn against the West German, ultimately West German political establishment than West Germans themselves are. And that is why we have seen these results in Saxony and in Thuringia. It's not because the mustachioed gentleman from the 1930s is coming back. It's not because a supporter of Stalin is sweeping in communist votes in former communist Eastern Germany. It's not because East Germany is very much poorer than West Germany. It is still poorer, but not to the extent that some people, I think, imagine. It's because there is a general mood in Germany that things are not going well, and in Eastern Germany, for historic reasons, they're more willing to vote against the establishment than in West Germany they are. Because in East Germany, it's the West German establishment, and in West Germany, it is their own establishment. Now, that then brings us to the ultimate point here, because logically, the most likely outcome of these votes in Thuringia and Saxony is that they must, in fact, they almost certainly do, spell the end of Chancellor Scholz's period in power. It's impossible to see how, after the results of the European elections and these results in these regional elections in Eastern Germany, it is impossible to see how Chancellor Scholz's government is going to survive the next Bundestag elections. In fact, already we're starting to see clear signs of disintegration. The various parties that make up the coalition are already anxiously looking for ways to compete against each other in the forthcoming parliamentary elections. And certainly the Greens and the FPD will probably run against Scholz, saying, that it was all his fault. They weren't really responsible for what went wrong. And the SPD and the FDP will also no doubt run against the Greens, or at least they will try to some degree. So obviously the current German coalition is living out its final days. But note that there is no great swing of support or popularity for the alternative, the mainstream alternative, which is the CDU. Friedrich Merz, of whom at one time much was expected, is, I understand, barely more popular than Scholz himself. We're likely to go from one bankrupt, exhausted and unpopular system government, the one we have now, to another bankrupt, unpopular, exhausted system government, the CDU, back in charge, this time led by Friedrich Merz, but with no more ideas about what to do about Germany's problems than the current government has. So we're likely to see a further period of political paralysis and dysfunction in Germany, even as the problems there get worse. But sooner or later, this upsurge of opposition that we have seen in East Germany is going to spill into West Germany as well. Now, there may be particular problems for the AfD, given the way it has been labelled, and in some cases, it has been, to say it frankly, at least the behaviour of some members of the AfD are deserving of some of the labels that have been thrown at them. I'm not saying this is true of the AfD as a whole. But if we look at the left party of Sarah Wagenknecht, I can certainly see how it might eventually begin to gain traction in parts of West Germany as well, very much in the way that Die Linke, the former expression, if you like, of the left, at one point was also able to do. And, well, deteriorating conditions in Germany are probably going to intensify this process, though the establishment in Germany is going to hold on as long as it can, with the backing of the EU centre and all the other forces in Europe which want things basically to stay as they are. And no one should expect or anticipate any early change. The one thing I think we can also predict is a concerted attempt by the bankrupt, intellectually bankrupt, and politically exhausted centre to try to maintain control by tightening the political screws, by engaging in more bans, more prohibitions, more restrictions on protests, more restrictions on media flows, all of those sort of things, more prosecutions as well. If that happens, nobody should be in any doubt as to what the underlying cause is. Of course, there may indeed be some cases when some people have acted beyond the level of the acceptable. But overall, repression of that kind in Germany will be repression of a bankrupt, intellectually bankrupt and politically exhausted centre, lacking ideas. It will be an attempt by that centre to repress those parties, those political forces, which in their very different ways are trying to come up with ideas about how to address Germany's underlying problems. In other words, it will be an attempt to prolong immobilism far beyond its natural point by repressing anything within the system that challenges it. Now, those of us who are familiar with German history know that we have in fact been here before. I've discussed this in previous programs. I used to bring it up during the time of Merkel. I said that one of the things that used to be said about the Habsburg Empire in the last decades before its eventual collapse was that administration had taken the place of government. In other words, the political system was no longer capable of coming up with solutions. What it did was simply administer the country with diminishing levels, ever diminishing levels of competence, even as the political system, the political polarization intensified. And well, there was, of course, eventually a crisis which led to a world war, and ultimately the whole thing came tumbling down. Well, I don't want to look too far ahead. I'm not going to predict how things are going to happen or play out in Germany in the future. But for the moment, at least, in Germany also, one could say that administration has taken the place of government, that the administrators, which is all that they are, who are in charge, are trying to manage things with diminishing levels of competence, and a bit as they did in late Habsburg Austria, they're also resorting increasingly to repression, which of course ultimately is going to make the situation worse. Well, that's what I'm going to say about Germany today. There can be an awful lot more said, many more things we can touch upon and discuss about Germany. Of course, there's also going to be many different views about the AfD, about Sarah Wagenknecht, about their various opinions and about their various views. But all I would say is, on this topic, perhaps even more than any other, be especially careful about what you read in the mainstream media, because in my opinion, almost all of it is wrong. Anyway, let's now turn to our perennial topic, the war in Ukraine. And yesterday I spoke about the importance of August 2024, and I'm going to return to that subject at the start of this program, for which please forgive me, but I'm going to say that August 2024 has been the single most decisive month in the entire conflict. It is the month in which it became clear that the Russians are going to win the war and that there is no force on planet Earth that can stop them doing so, short of the Western powers risking World War III. And it is also the month when I think it became increasingly clear that the Western powers are not prepared to risk World War III. The United States refuses to allow Ukraine to conduct deep strikes inside Russia. Macron's ideas of a few months ago of sending contingents of French and NATO troops to Ukraine, well, we're not hearing anything more about it anymore. And the other idea of NATO air forces flying over Ukraine, imposing no-fly zones, shooting down Russian missiles, it turns out that there's not much enthusiasm across NATO or indeed in the United States for that idea also. So the West is not going to intervene in Russia. At least I suspect that this is now the view in Moscow. I think that the Russians have come to the view in Moscow that they've come to the view that there is not going to be a Western military intervention on Ukraine's behalf, and that the war in Ukraine has passed its tipping point, and that we are now moving rapidly, or perhaps not rapidly, but we're moving conclusively towards a Russian military victory. I think the other factor which served as a brake on Russian actions up to now, was that I think August also cleared up the diplomatic atmosphere. I think that several countries in the global south, amongst the BRICS, had been floating ideas about mediation, about negotiations between Ukraine and Russia to end the war. President Lula of Brazil has talked about this extensively. Prime Minister Modi made his trip to Kiev. Prime Minister Orban of Hungary visited Kiev and Moscow and then went on to Beijing and Washington. It's clear that Ukraine is not capable of taking advantage of these diplomatic initiatives. It cannot imagine any settlement of the conflict that contradicts Zelensky's hopeless formula, and in fact, it destroyed the prospects of negotiations by its operation in Kursk region, taking the pressure off the Russians to begin negotiations. And so the Russians, in a sense, now find themselves in a situation where they are winning the war. They are not going to be prevented militarily from achieving a military victory. And in diplomatic terms, their position has never been simpler or stronger. They have the political space to go on advancing westwards to win the war in Ukraine, and the restraints that previously existed have fallen away. However, that places the Russians under the burden of themselves deciding what the final outcome of the conflict in Ukraine is going to be. And I returned in my program yesterday to the big question that Eve Smith has been repeatedly asking in article after article that she has written on naked capitalism, which is, what if Ukraine never negotiates? What if the West never negotiates? What if they are not prepared to concede Russian demands that Anatol Lieven, in that article I discussed yesterday, acknowledged? The entire political establishment in Moscow, from its furthest liberal end all the way to its most hawkish nationalist end, is united about, which is that Ukraine must remain neutral. It cannot join NATO. What if the West and Ukraine don't agree, won't negotiate about that, regardless of what happens in the war? What, in that case, do the Russians do? Do they go on advancing westwards? Do they cross the Dnieper? Do they capture Kiev? Do they try to set up some kind of puppet government in Kiev? Do they engage in a new round of annexations? I am not convinced that even the Russians have worked out their plans. Up to now, I suspect that in the Kremlin, in the Foreign Ministry and the Defense Ministry and the General Staff and in the various economic agencies of the Russian government, the Economics Ministry, the Finance Ministry, the Central Bank, they've all been thinking instead about how to manage the war itself. That's been the priority, achieving military victory. But now that military victory is on the horizon, it is starting to appear and come closer, they will start to have to think about this, and they will need to start thinking about what the ultimate plan for Ukraine is going to be. Because I have come to the view that there aren't going to be negotiations with the government in Kiev. I think that the government in Kiev is incapable of conducting negotiations. Again, irrespective of what happens on the battlefronts, I think that if Kiev is captured, if that government, that Ukrainian government survives and transfers to Lvov, they will still refuse to conduct negotiations. They will continue to insist that Zelensky's formula should be implemented in full, however fantastic and surreal that is. And if the Russians advance all the way west to Lvov, that government goes into exile and reestablishes itself perhaps in London or in Canada or in some place like that, I still think that that government will refuse to conduct any kind of negotiations. It will continue to insist that it is the government of Ukraine. It will say that Ukraine is an occupied country. It will continue to insist on Ukraine's sovereign right to join NATO, and it will refuse to acknowledge or accept in any shape or form, de facto or de jure, Russia's occupation of Ukraine's eastern regions. And I think that replacing Zelensky with some other political figure coming from the existing political system, the post-Maidan political system, is not going to change that or alter the reality. I don't think that Poroshenko or Zaluzhny or Arsen Avakov or any of these characters that have been mentioned are remotely capable of conducting the kind of negotiation with the Russians that the Russians would need if some kind of a peace were to be achieved. And I think that this Ukrainian government, which the Western powers would undoubtedly continue to recognize as the Ukrainian government, were it to be still in Lvov were it to be still in Kiev or in Lvov or in London or Paris or Toronto or wherever, I think, as I said, that it is incapable of negotiations. And I think that the West also would be immovable, will continue to be immovable, unshiftable on all of these matters. So then that leaves the Russians with a dilemma. Do they, as I said, set up a government in Kiev which exercises effective control, but which nobody outside Ukraine recognizes? Or do they start holding referendums in the central Ukrainian regions, which probably, by the way, without much compulsion, would vote for union with Russia, certainly in the central Ukrainian regions? I suspect that quite a few people there would vote that way if they thought that it would achieve peace. And of course, it's important to remember that these regions have historically been under Moscow's sway, so that for the people there, this would not be such a historically extraordinary thing. And of course, that still leaves unresolved the question of Western Ukraine. But then who knows, that problem might resolve itself. Maybe as the Russians move westwards, the people of Western Ukraine, many of them will leave. A lamentable fact if it happens, a tragic one if it happens. But politically, one can see how that might solve some of the Russians' difficulties. But of course, there's also a possibility that they will stay, or that enough of them will choose to stay to continue to cause for the Russians long-term political difficulties. Anyway, one way or the other, I think that at some point over the next few weeks, this debate, which has so far, in my opinion, been deferred in Russia, is going to start. Anatol Lieven's article suggested that such a debate does already exist, though I suspect very much on the margins. I think now important people are going to have to start coming up with ideas and plans in Moscow. And perhaps I ought to say that if you know your Russian history, the Russians do tend to come up eventually with plans, and surprisingly enough, or perhaps not so surprisingly, given how well they know this particular region. But anyway, it could be that these plans will work. But I think that in Moscow, from now on, the politics of the eventual Ukrainian settlement will now start getting more priority from Russian decision makers. Now, of course, for there to be a settlement, the war needs to be won. So what has been happening over the last couple of hours? Well, the first thing to say is that this morning there was another massive Russian missile strike across Ukraine. From what I can understand, a large part of this missile strike took place using land-based ballistic missiles, most probably Iskander-Ms. Kharkiv was a particular target. It's been suggested that the 3rd Assault Brigade, which is part of the Azov brigade complex, is now located in Kharkiv, and that it was a particular target. The Artyom factory in Kiev appears to have been targeted again. Anyway, there was a major missile strike by the Russians across Ukraine, focusing more on central and eastern Ukraine this time. I'm not going to discuss it further. I think we need to wait a little in order to get more information about it. The Russian Defense Ministry will no doubt provide us with details soon. This is the third big missile strike that Russia has launched against Ukraine since missile strikes resumed with a gigantic missile strike that took place on the 26th of August. So let us now turn to the situation on the battlefronts. Now, yesterday I said that there were reports that the Russians had conducted a frontal assault on Vuhledar, this fortified town in southern Donbass. It's been a bone in the throat of the Russian army in southern Donbass, basically since the fighting began. But with the general deterioration of the situation on the battlefronts, the Ukrainian command apparently was planning to transfer the 72nd Brigade, which has been defending Vuhledar, to some other part of the front line to plug the gaps there. Well, we've had more information over the last few hours, and it appears that though the Russians have been bombing and shelling Vuhledar with a degree of intensity that has never been the case before at any point in the war, they have not actually begun a direct assault on the town itself. However, they are mounting an offensive in the area of Vuhledar. One was in the area of the coal mine and slag heap, which is located immediately to the northeast of Vuhledar, and which again apparently towers over the surrounding landscape. It's another one of these coal mines and slag heaps which enables anybody who is in control to overwatch the entire area. It seems that there's also been a Russian attack on the village of Vodyane, still further to the northeast, and the Russians apparently have now broken into the village of Prechistivka, which is located some distance to the west of Vuhledar. So it does look as if a Vuhledar offensive is underway by the Russian army. They seem to be taking the first steps to cut off Vuhledar from any further point of supply. Prechistivka is, by the way, located on the western supply road, which the Ukrainians are probably now having to rely upon, given that the main supply road sending supplies to Vuhledar through Konstantinovka has been lost. So Prechistivka further cuts off Vuhledar. The attack on Prechistivka further cuts off Vuhledar from resupply, and it's likely that there will be an attack on Vuhledar at some point over the next couple of days. Now, I want to say that almost certainly this attack is in some way, the timing of this attack, though obviously not its planning, but the timing of it perhaps is connected with the movements or alleged movements of the 72nd Brigade. However, it may be the case that the reason for the Russian attack now is not that the 72nd Brigade has actually left Vuhledar. It is, on the contrary, that the Russians want to launch an attack on Vuhledar to prevent it leaving. The reason for that is that, as I discussed yesterday, it makes, at least to me, logical sense that the Ukrainian command should want to evacuate this elite brigade from Vuhledar, which looks like it's about to be surrounded, and redeploy it elsewhere on the front lines, where it might actually do something useful. Whereas perhaps the Russians are making exactly the same calculation and are saying to themselves that it is important for them to keep this elite Ukrainian brigade in Vuhledar to prevent the Ukrainians redeploying it elsewhere, where it could do something to the Russians that might affect or prolong or delay Russian offensives in other places. So I don't know what the facts are, but I am going to make my own general observation about this, which is that, in a sense, it hardly matters. The point is that Vuhledar is now living its final days as a Ukrainian-controlled town. So that's the situation in Vuhledar. The big news, the main fighting is taking place elsewhere in the Pokrovsk region, and there's been a cascade of articles today, 2 articles in the London Times, for example, both of them talking about the increasingly grim situation in the area of Pokrovsk. One of the articles in the Times said that the Russian force that is closing in on Pokrovsk itself, not, by the way, the force that's closing in on Selidovo, Ukrainsk, which has just captured Novogrodivka, but specifically the force that seems to be moving towards Pokrovsk numbers around 40,000 men, and that the Ukrainians, whatever reinforcements they send to the area, they cannot hold this force back. The Russians have a big superiority in numbers and, of course, in material as well. So anyway, let's now explore what's going on in the Pokrovsk, Selidovo, Ukrainsk area. Well, yesterday we got definite proof that the Russians are indeed in Ukrainsk. This is this a small town, around 10,000 people, located south of the E50 highway, the highway from Donetsk to Pokrovsk. The Russians have entered it. There is fighting going on. Radovka says that the Ukrainian garrison in Ukrainsk is very small, and they're also saying that there are no fortifications to speak of in Ukrainsk. It looks highly likely that Ukrainsk will be captured by the Russians relatively quickly. There are also reports that the Russians have either captured entirely or largely the village of Zelanye Pershe, which is located to the south of Galitsinivka, and that they are probably close to capturing the next village further south, the village of Zelanye Drucha. I mispronounced its name yesterday, but I believe that is closer to the way that its name is actually pronounced. And there's even some suggestions that once these two villages have been captured, the Russians will swerve westwards to attack the next town, which is a town called Girnik. And beyond Girnik, there's other places, small villages like Izmailivka, Novoselidivka, and others. And I'm not going to go into the details of all of this. So that this is what is happening in all of these places. Now, over the last 2 or 3 days, there's been a lot of talk about a large Ukrainian force, 3 brigades, located south of Karlovka, Netailovo, and Pervomaisky, west of Nivolskoye, and and north of Krasnogorovka, which supposedly all of these Russian movements are supposed to surround, to create a cauldron around. And yesterday I expressed my profound skepticism that this was so, that the Ukrainian command has really left 3 whole brigades of Ukrainian troops in these empty fields, controlling and garrisoning nothing as far as I could see. And I also said that it seemed to me unlikely that all of these Russian movements were actually intended to create an encirclement of these forces, which looked to me like an over-ambitious operation, and one anyway which, given that I don't believe that the Ukrainians are actually there, has any purpose to it. I have suggested that the main objective of the Russians is to secure the road, the main road, supply road, from Donetsk city to Pokrovsk, to assist the Russian offensive when it comes against Pokrovsk. And I still think that this is the main purpose of what it is that the Russians are doing. But Dima at the Military Summary channel has, I think, probably also got another part of the explanation, which is that this area continues to be dotted with coal mines and slag heaps, which potentially form powerful fortified positions if they are converted to that and garrisoned properly. And that the Russians are in the process of capturing all of these coal mines and fortifications and slag heaps before the Ukrainians can occupy them properly and fortify them in order to create potential defense lines in this area. And I am sure he is right, and I am sure that this partly explains all of the various movements that the Russians are making. So capturing Ukrainsk, perhaps Zelanye Pershe and Zelanye Drucha, perhaps Gernik, perhaps some other villages to the south of Selidovo and to the west of Ukrainsk, not only strengthens Russian positions along the main road and secures the Russian advance in Selidovo itself, but it also provides the Russians with control of all of these potential fortified positions that apparently exist in this area in some abundance. So I think this is logical, and I think this is what the Russians are really about. And that, by the way, brings me to what's going on in Selidovo itself. Now, yesterday we were getting reports that the Ukrainians had rushed reinforcements to Selidovo, that the reinforcements had counterattacked, that there were bitter battles, and in fact, apparently there's a picture of a Ukrainian tank firing on a Russian armored vehicle in eastern Selidovo. So that is consistent with some kind of Ukrainian counterattack. But the counterattack, such as it was, appears to have run its course, because late last night, we were getting reports that the Russians are advancing within Selidovo again, that the Ukrainians have spent themselves in this counterattack, that they no longer have the forces necessary to hold back the Russians in Selidovo, and that the Russians are gradually pushing through Selidovo, pushing westwards, and that Selidovo, well, apparently they now control around a third of it, and perhaps at some point over the next couple of days, it will fall completely under their control. I believe that this is true. Of course, as I say many times, I'm not on location. I'm not sure exactly what is the case, but I think it is highly likely that this is the situation at the moment in Selidovo itself. There's no doubt that the Russians are there, and there's no doubt that Selidovo fairly soon is going to fall. In fact, I have no doubt of this at all. Now, the other drama is about what is happening further north around Pokrovsk. Now, reports in the Western media confirm that the Russians control all of Novogrodivka. There's now pictures which show Russian troops inside Novogrodivka with their flags. There's pictures of Russian tanks and armored vehicles in the central square of Novogrodivka, which does indeed look almost intact. The troops look very relaxed and very confident. So, looks as if Novogrodivka has passed entirely under Russian control. I believe Grodivka itself is under Russian control. All of the Russian reporting platforms and the neutral ones like Suryak say so. DS, the Ukrainian project, apparently still claims that part of Grodivka is under Ukrainian control. I think it is unlikely myself, but it might be the case. Again, I'm not on the scene. I can't say for certain. The main force that the Russians have deployed up to now has tended to be in the south, so Grodivka perhaps has received less attention. But there are lots of reports that the Russians have now captured the two villages of Krasny Yar and Kruty Yar, and that they have also captured the northern village of Nikolaevka, close to the main road linking Grodivka with Mirnograd. There are apparently lots of pictures of wrecked Ukrainian vehicles on this road, which shows that if there is still a garrison fighting in the western suburbs of Grodivka, then the Ukrainians are suffering extremely heavy losses trying to keep it supplied. But anyway, it does look as if, I think, Grodivka has fallen, and the Russians certainly do appear to be in a strong position to advance further up this road to Mirnograd itself. Now, there was a very interesting discussion of the potential battle for Pokrovsk by Redovka Russian newspaper, as I've said many times, based in Smolensk. They have large reporting team working for them, so they're very well informed about the situation on the battlefronts. They're suggesting what I myself believe to be the case, which is that once the situation in Selidovo and Ukrainsk, and perhaps some of the other villages there, has been resolved, before attacking Pokrovsk itself, the Russians will then take steps to clear the villages to the north and west of Pokrovsk, the villages along the main supply road, leading ultimately to Konstantinovka and Chasov Yar, the villages like Vozvizhenka, Yelizavetivka, Malinivka, Mirolyubivka, and Novoekonomichny. And that once these villages are captured, which should be a tale of at most a few weeks, then with the Russians positioned all around Pokrovsk, and perhaps also, once they have control of these villages, able to launch drone attacks on Ukrainian supply convoys or railways, trying to send supplies to Pokrovsk from the west or from the north, then the Russians will attack Pokrovsk, and it will be, as always, a multi-pronged operation intending to capture this place, Pokrovsk, by storming it from various directions. And I suspect that Redovka is right. It is the method the Russians always use when they attack urban settlements. They like to attack from multiple vectors rather than seek to attack in just one place. So anyway, that's the situation in Pokrovsk. As I said, there are increasingly urgent and desperate articles in the Western media about the situation in Pokrovsk, heart-rending articles about Ukrainian, or at least the population of Pokrovsk, trying to escape the gathering storm. One gets the sense from some of these articles that the evacuation from Pokrovsk is being barely organized. Most people who are in Pokrovsk and who are trying to get out are trying to do it themselves. There doesn't appear to be any real organization to the retreat from Pokrovsk, the evacuation from Pokrovsk. And again, if you read articles like the two articles I mentioned in the London Times, they're littered now with complaints from Ukrainian soldiers about the military situation and criticism which I suspect the editors of the Times and of the other Western media outlets have probably toned down. Criticism of the Kursk operation, the way it's diverted essential forces from the Pokrovsk battlefronts to the adventure in Kursk. One of the two articles, by the way, in the London Times is by the London Times' long-standing commentator on the war, Michael Clark. He still seems to hold out the hope that the Russians will divert large forces from the Donbass battle lines. He's talking about very depleted Russian reserves, and this supposedly explains why the Russians haven't assembled a huge force in the Kursk region to expel the Ukrainians there. He mentions, with every appearance of skepticism and even incomprehension, the point repeatedly made now by Russian officials, including Ambassador Polyansky, in an interview we did with him on the Duran, Glenn Deason and I, that as far as the Russians are concerned, Kursk is, of course, Russian territory, but so is Donbass, so is Donetsk and Lugansk. There is no reason why the Russians should psychologically treat the situation in Kursk differently from the way they treat the situation elsewhere on the battlefronts. Michael Clark has difficulty understanding this. Again, I don't think he understands the Russian way of thinking about the conflict at all. And as for depleted Russian reserves, to be frank, I simply don't know what he's talking about. I assume that he is still unable to see all of the evidence of a huge build-up by the Russians that has been taking place basically since the start of last year. I think that he's in denial about it, and as I think many people in the West still are. But anyway, there we go. He finds it strange, as I said, that the Russians haven't deployed forces from Donbass to Kursk. They're not going to. And I think that the sooner this fact is accepted, the better. Anyway, we've had further news from Toretsk. I'm going to cover this very briefly. The Russians continue their advances in Toretsk. They seem to be focusing more now on clearing the villages to the north of Toretsk. I don't think, again, that this is an encirclement operation exactly. I think more the Russians are again intent on cutting off the supply lines and in putting themselves in a position where they can attack Toretsk from multiple directions. Again, Toretsk, in my opinion, is going through its final days. And some of the articles that I have been reading in the media, at least in Britain, also speak, without giving much detail, about a deterioration of the situation in Chasiv Yar. I suspect that we're going to discover at some point in the next few days that the entire central area of Chasiv Yar is now under Russian control, and that the Russians are now attacking the western outskirts of Chasiv Yar, and that Ukrainian resistance in Chasiv Yar is crumbling. And of course, as I mentioned yesterday, the Russians appear to be in the brink of capturing the village of Grigorievka, which is located to the northwest of Chasiv Yar. And as for the fighting in Kursk region itself, the fighting which has attracted all of this attention, Group of Forces North continue to tell us that they're on the attack, that they are in fact advancing, that it is the Ukrainians now who are falling back. And interestingly, Group of Forces North say that the armoured vehicle losses which the Ukrainians have experienced in Kursk region are now so severe that the Ukrainians are increasingly obliged to conduct operations on foot because they no longer have armoured vehicles that can move them around on the battlefronts. So, this is a very, as I said, summary account of what is, to all appearances, a massive ongoing battle. I suspect that Selidovo, Kukryansk, all of these places come under Russian control very quickly. Then there will be the main attack on Pokrovsk. And I suspect Pokrovsk will probably fall around the same time that Chasiv Yar and Toretsk also fall. At that point, as I've said, the spine of Ukrainian resistance in Donbass will have been broken. The Russians are now literally at the gates of Kupiansk in the north. Having captured the village of Sinkovka there and various other villages. They reached the outskirts of Siversk, having recently captured the village of Vyemka. Group of Forces North have been making steady progress in Volchansk, in the area of the high-rise buildings. By the end of this month, I think that there is a fair chance that all of these places, Pokrovsk, maybe, Toretsk, Chasiv Yar, will have been captured. And then the last battle in Donbass, the battle for Kramatorsk and Slavyansk, will begin, though the first part of it will probably not be fought directly in those two towns, but in the town of Konstantinovka, which lies immediately to the south. And of course, when these places are captured by the Russians, when Slavyansk and Kramatorsk are captured by the Russians, the Donbass, all of it will be under Russian control. The Russians will probably have an open road to the Dnieper. They will quite plausibly will have already advanced to the Dnieper along the road from Pokrovsk by that point. And then not only will Ukrainian positions in the north, in Kharkiv region, and in Chernigov and Sumy regions also become untenable, but probably in Zaporozhye region also, places like Orekhov and even Zaporozhye city. And it will be possible at that point to start talking about the end game. We could be looking at the start of the military end game around October, November, maybe the time when the United States goes to the polls. So that, it seems to me, is, well, I'm not going to say it's definitely the timeline. The Ukrainians may still have resources they can throw into the battle, though it's increasingly difficult to see what they are. But I am going to guess that it's not that far off what the direction of events is going to be. And at some point around then, I think the discussions and debates in Moscow about the post-conflict future of this region are going to start in earnest, and we perhaps will start to see the first indicators of that debate in the Russian media. Meanwhile, the Russian economy continues to grow. Anton Siluanov, the Russian finance minister, is predicting that Russia will achieve 3.9% GDP growth this year. Perhaps could be slightly more, 4%, who knows? These figures anyway are going to be revised in the future. I suspect we're going to discover that last year's growth was not 3.6%, but closer to 4%. And this year's growth will not be 4%, but perhaps a bit more. But that's only a guess. Economic growth will slow in the next few months in Russia because the central bank wants it to. It is now way beyond its inflation target, though it should be said still that inflation is still fairly under control. I think assumptions, claims that there is an inflation crisis in Russia are wrong. I suspect if you count inflation the way the Russians do, you would find that it's not that far out of line with inflation in certain countries further to the west. Though again, in light of the sensitivities of this platform, I'm not going to discuss that in much detail. And going beyond that, I suspect that we're going to have further economic strength in Russia next year, growth targets higher, growth results higher than the central bank is expecting, even as inflation begins to fall. And the problems with the financing, the financial movements between Russia and certain other countries that the current administration has been trying to create, I suspect that as of next year, these will start to settle as well. Again, the direction of events is very clear, as we saw this morning with the announcement that Turkey has now made a formal public application to join the BRICS. So there we are. Now, just before I finish this program, I wanted to say something, which is about a recent mammoth article, very interesting article by Simplicius the Thinker about maneuver warfare. And I found it a most interesting article because it confirms, at least to me, something which I have suspected all along. I ask for forgiveness when I say this, that in fact, a lot of the claims about the enormous difficulty of conducting maneuver warfare, which supposedly exists nowadays because of the tremendous surveillance that exists over the battlefields provided by satellites and drones and that sort of thing, that these kind of comments are not historically well-founded. It has never been possible at any point since modern war began, basically at the beginning of the 20th century, to take the enemy completely by surprise. Even Operation Barbarossa did not take the Soviets quite as much by surprise as I think many people think who are unfamiliar with the actual historical material. Just saying. Now, the point is, and I get to dwell on the Soviet-German War of 1941-45 because that's what Simplicius the Thinker mostly talks about. Anyway, he makes the point that maneuver warfare, blitzkrieg warfare, the kind of thing we all imagine, lightning strikes by armored columns moving at tremendous speed across the countryside, gaining control of vast territories and destabilizing the enemy. That only happened during the Second World War, when one side or the other had a major manpower and material advantage. Simplicius the Thinker makes the point that the same is true about the various wars that have been fought in the Middle East, the war that was fought, for example, by the two wars that were fought, for example, by the United States against the Iraqis in 1991 and in 2003. And at all other times, when we're talking about wars between peer adversaries, it is a slugfest, a long war of attrition before the cumulative strength of one side grows to the point where it achieves that level of superiority over the other that it is able to switch to maneuver warfare and start achieving the kind of decisive results which people associate with it. And he makes the point that the Germans had such an advantage over the Soviets in 1941, and that's how they made rapid advances deep into Russia. And then from 1942 until 1944, there was a rough balance in power between the Germans and the Soviets. So even though gradually the balance of advantage, material advantage, shifted to the Soviets, it was a terrible war of attrition between the Soviets and the Germans on the Eastern Front, with the Soviets making sometimes substantial but always incremental gains. And then eventually, the effect of that attrition became visible in 1944. That was the point when the Soviets finally gained a decisive margin of advantage over the Germans, and that was when maneuver warfare could begin. And I think we're seeing exactly the same play out in Ukraine. We've had prolonged attrition. The Russians advanced into Ukraine at lightning speed in the first few weeks of the special military operation in February and March 2022. Then the Ukrainians mobilized. They brought their army up to strength. They received weapons from the West. A rough equivalence between the two armies was then achieved. We had a very, very difficult slugfest in 2022, 2023 and 2024 and the early part of 2024. But halfway through 2024, after the fall of Avdiivka, the effect of attrition on the Ukrainians has started to become increasingly visible, and the Russians, as a result, are able to advance faster, and maneuver warfare is again beginning to become possible. Attrition is not new in war. It was how the Civil War, the American Civil War, was won. It was how the war in the Eastern Front during the Second World War was won, though of course the attrition there came with a human cost which is almost unimaginable. And it is how this war is being won in Ukraine. Well, this is where I finish my program today. More from me soon. Let me remind you again that you can find all our programs on our various platforms, Locals, Rumble and X. Don't forget you can support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar. And also don't forget to go to our shop where you can find all sorts of amazing things, links under this video. And last but not least, please remember, if you like this video, to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. That's me for today. More from me soon. Have a very good day.